Hello there, philosophers. Welcome back. I hope you had a great break. And we're going to start off our new year with a discussion of utilitarianism, a theory of normative ethics. Now, utilitarianism is a normative ethics theory just like as Aristotelian ethics and Kantian ethics, but whereas Aristotle was interested in practical wisdom to bring about good moral character, and Kant was interested in duty and in rational thinking directed towards human dignity and respect for other human beings. Utilitarians are interested in the consequences of our actions and our decisions. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism, and consequentialism claims that the consequences of an action are the only relevant consideration in determining whether or not the action is morally right or wrong. So that means that intentions, moral character, duty, moral principles, all of these things are irrelevant except as they relate to the consequences of our actions and decisions. Now, this will become clearer as we go further along. Utilitarianism was first introduced by Jeremy Bentham and then developed by John Stuart Mill. Jeremy Bentham thought that the right thing to do is determined by the principle of utility, or the greatest happiness principle. In other words, the right thing to do in any given situation, is whatever promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So, in other words, utilitarianism is an attempt to rationalize ethics by turning it into an equation. Right action equals the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, what does this equation really mean? Well, this depends on how we define happiness and even how we define people. It also depends on how we quantify happiness, if quantification of happiness is even possible. So, how do you define the word people? Stop and think for a minute. Traditionally, utilitarians limited ethics to only the consideration of human welfare, so only humans were considered people. But in the 20th century, philosophers like Peter Singer sought to expand moral consideration to non-human animals. So non-human animals may not be considered people, but they're still worthy of ethics. After all, isn't animal cruelty immoral? If it is, then shouldn't we all be vegetarians? That's a hot topic. More on that later. How do you define and quantify happiness? Utilitarians are hedonistic. They think that happiness consists of pleasure and unhappiness consists of pain. Therefore, we can determine whether an action is right or wrong by determining, or at least estimating, how much pleasure and how much pain will be the result of the action. With utilitarianism, we just need to do the math or perform a utility calculus. Utilitarians, therefore, equate happiness with pleasure. But are all pleasures equal? Mill, John Stuart Mill, doesn't think so. He says, it is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and valuable than others. It would be absurd that, while in estimating all other things, quality is considered as well as quantity, the estimation of pleasure should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. So basically he says quality counts just as much or more than quantity. But how do we determine the quality of happiness, or the quality of pleasures? In discussing different qualities of pleasure, Mill says, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. Now, stop for a minute. What do you think this means? What might be some examples of higher pleasures? Why does Mill think this? And do you agree? Now, I'm not going to give you the answer to these questions. I want you to take time and really think about them to understand what Mill is saying here. So far we have been discussing act utilitarianism, which is the theory that any action can be judged right or wrong based on whether it brings the most amount of happiness to the greatest number of people. Remember, that's what Jeremy Bentham said. Act utilitarianism has some challenges, though. As we discussed, we first have to agree on the meanings of words like happiness and people in order to determine whether any given action is the right thing to do. This part shouldn't be too hard, though. There are some other challenges for act utilitarians, though. Secondly, as there are a potentially infinite number of consequences resulting from any particular action we take, it seems impractical that one could successfully perform a utility calculation and determine the best or the absolute best course of action when faced with a moral dilemma. Think about it. Think about how many consequences there can be for any particular action. However, utilitarians might respond by saying that you have to simply do your best given the circumstances. Finally, this theory is arguably too demanding. One could interpret it as suggesting that if any given action is not the absolute best action one could take in that moment, then it is an immoral action. Must one always take the best course of action in any situation in order to be a good person? Now, act utilitarians might respond by suggesting that this is not necessarily a bad thing. It might be a good thing to have a very demanding, normative, ethical theory. In order to address the latter two challenges, you can take a look back at those challenges to remind yourself, if you need to. Some utilitarians, including John Stuart Mill, have distinguished act utilitarianism from rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism, to remind you, is any action can be judged right or wrong based on whether it brings the most amount of happiness to the greatest number of people. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, suggests that some actions tend to bring about happiness, while other actions tend to bring about suffering. As a rule, we should consider actions in the former category to be right actions, and actions in the latter category to be wrong actions. Thus, assault with a deadly weapon is wrong because it generally tends to bring about more suffering than happiness, and generous giving is right because it generally tends to bring about more happiness than suffering. Hence, this is why we have moral and legal prohibitions against assault and why we generally encourage generosity in our society. Okay, so we've talked a lot about utilitarianism, different types of utilitarianism, different interpretations of utilitarianism. Now it's time to put this knowledge into practice. Please try to come up with 3 examples of wrong actions in the following areas: killing, assaulting, abusing, lying, stealing, cheating, manipulating, bullying, polluting, torturing, being apathetic. Of course, these are not so nice things to think about, but it's helpful to clarify this theory. Would an act utilitarian say that these examples are wrong? Why? And would a rule utilitarian say that these examples are wrong and why? All right, Ed, please come up with 3 examples right now and answer those 2 questions. All right, next we're going to try to come up with 3 examples of right actions in the following areas: acting out of compassion, telling the truth, helping a friend, helping a stranger. Oh, these are much nicer, aren't they? Refusing to cheat, steal, kill, or lie. Recycling. Meet a we if you have a Meet a We program in your school. Making positive change. And if you have a kindness project in your school, there's a principle of seeing the best in others. So basically just try to come up with 3 examples of good things to do, right actions, and try to answer these questions. Would an act utilitarian say it is right or wrong? Would a rule utilitarian say it is right or wrong? Why do you think so? And actually, you can change those wrongs to rights. Okay, so that's it for the lecture part of this lesson. The next part will be an assignment. Your assignment will be to submit to the Dropbox basically 5 different paragraphs. And those paragraphs will be on 5 of the topics listed below. So you're to choose 5 of these topics and construct 5 utilitarian moral arguments. There will be more instruction on the assignment page, and then just remember to submit it to the Dropbox and send me an email if you have any questions about any of it. Okay, thanks very much.